Can you hear me, Laura?
Okay, I think since it's 11 now, we'll kick off. So welcome everyone to the first session of the content track. We have Hannah, who's going to go first. She is going to be talking all about what to do when you get stuck in your ideation phase of your content strategy. So her talk is called No Idea. She is awesome. I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot. So I'll hand over to Hannah now.
Thank you very much. And thanks for joining me, everyone. So, straight away, I can't get my slides to work. Let's try this. Hooray, we're here. Hello there. I've previously worked at both Distilled and Verve Search on teams that collectively secured over 22,000 pieces of linked coverage from places like this. We created things like the following. This was called The View from Here, and it's a photo series in collaboration with people from 27 different countries. So another piece we did, it's called Demolishing Modernism. It's a series of illustrations of the modernist architecture that we've lost to the wrecking ball. And the final example I'm just going to show you is called What Would You Tell Your Teenage Self? And this is a selection of quotes from what some of today's most successful people. It's all about what they tell their younger selves. So I now no longer work for Verve Search. I'm a creative content consultant. You can find out more about me at wordress.com. Since going out on my own last year, creative block is something I've been asked about a lot, hence the talk today. So first up, what is creative block? I think it's this, when you have no ideas and no idea what to do next. But what's the opposite of creative block? Well, I think it's this. I think it's when you're in flow. What's flow, though? Well, flow is when you know what to do and you know how to do it and you know that you're doing it well. It's when you're fully immersed in the task that you're doing and you're actually actively enjoying it. You're enjoying what you're doing. I think perhaps the best description of flow is this. It's when work feels like play, and if you're doing ideation, for example, ideas come easily to you. So whilst being in flow might not feel like work, actually you're working really hard, but it's a glorious feeling. So how do we get from creative block to flow? Well, here's the thing. I think that we often talk about creative block as if it's a specific, singular, concrete problem. But I think that the truth is actually creative block is a catch-all term for a whole bunch of very different problems. The net result of all those problems is the same, right? We feel hopelessly stuck. But if you want to unstick yourself and get in flow, I think you need to figure out what sort of creative block you're suffering from. So this is going to provide the framework of our talk. So there's kind of 5 key points here, which I'm going to go through. So first, do you know what to do? Well, without a clear goal, I think it can be really tough to figure out where to begin in terms of ideation. And I often hear stuff like this: constraints fuel creativity. And honestly, I think it's sort of true, but it's not quite the full story. I think what fuels creativity actually is striking a balance between freedom and constraint. Too many constraints limit possibilities. There's no space for us to play, and we get stuck. But conversely, too much freedom makes it hard to figure out where to start. So too much freedom can also act as a block. I think what we need to do is strike a balance. So in some instances, I think that the creative brief is the problem. So a brief with too many constraints can definitely cause problems. This is a brief I got once: come up with creative ideas about motorized window blinds. Now that might be possible, but it's an incredibly restrictive brief. Conversely, though, the absence of a brief or an overly open brief can also cause blocks. Another thing you commonly hear, this client is open to anything. You have complete creative freedom and something inside me dies. Because it's actually very difficult to come up with workable ideas about just anything. Where on earth do you start? So this leads me nicely into, I think, what a creative brief should contain. I think as a minimum, you need 5 to 10 sites where the client or company want coverage. The reason why I say 5 to 10 is if they give you 5 to 10, you can push that out and make that 100, but 5 to 10 will give you enough to get started with. Another thing I think which is really useful is a list of topics that the client absolutely won't entertain. That is very, very useful. There's some other stuff that's nice to have. So it is cool if you can get hold of some topics which the client or company are keen to explore. Now, I've kind of put a caveat on this because I feel like it often goes awry. Often, instead of topics, what I frequently see are product or service offerings. So rather than a list of topics, so for example, I was asked to do some ideation for a legal firm, and I was like, what kind of topics are you open to exploring? And they said, like public liability lawsuits. And I was like, that's not really a topic, that's something you offer. So another thing which is useful, a bit about who they're seeking to attract in terms of customers. So who are they actually looking to attract to their business? Again, this can be problematic because lots of companies target very broad audiences, but in some instances, this can be really, really helpful. The thing I love to ask, and if you can get a response from this, I think you're golden, some examples of content they wish they'd made. If you can get an answer to this, so get the client or company to share with you some of the stuff that they've seen other people do that they really like, I think that can be really powerful in terms of direction because it gives you a sense of what are they aspiring to create, what are they open to. So that stuff's really nice to have. So creative briefs can definitely cause blocks, but sometimes the block is actually in your head. So the next thing I want to talk about is mindset problems. Sometimes I think we see limits that aren't really there. So in the past, I've been asked to come up with creative ideas for a company that sells contact lenses, or for a VPN provider, or for a mattress review company. And on dark days, when I'm seeing only limits, this is what I actually hear. Come up with creative ideas about contact lenses, or about VPNs, or about mattress reviews. Now, that's not actually what I've been asked to do, but it can be a hard mindset to shake off. But it's important that you do, because thinking like that obviously will limit me unnecessarily. And if you're thinking like that, it will limit you too. So there are a couple of things I like to do if I suspect that this is something that's going on for me. So for the example with contact lenses, here, what I'm doing is really just thinking bigger. So I jump from contact lenses to sight, to optics, to optical illusions, spot the X puzzles. Those are those things where you have to find the flamingo in a sea of ballerinas, or the reverse. Seeing Jesus on a slice of toast is a type of pareidolia, which is fun. Change blindness, color blindness, this kind of thing. The other direction I've gone in is thinking about vision, and vision in the biggest sense. How do people see the world? How do our perspectives differ? And what this does is it just opens stuff out. So I'm not thinking in quite such a small way specifically about contact lenses. I'm thinking about bigger topics. With the VPN provider, actually something that proved really useful for me here was, rather than thinking about the product or service, thinking about why people use it. So people use VPNs for privacy and data security, to bypass censorship, to access content like TV, music, and gaming, to get the best deals like money-saving stuff. And this actually, again, opens up a whole new tranche of topics that we can look at and potentially create content around. And that feels a lot easier to do than kind of focusing purely on VPNs. Finally, come up with creative ideas for a mattress review company. Here I'm thinking about what's connected to the product or service. So I've gone from mattress to bed to sleep. Brilliant. Sleep, we've got tons of stuff, right? We've got sleep conditions, sleep problems. What happens if you don't get enough sleep? There's a whole load of medical problems which actually can arise from not getting enough sleep. We can talk about dreams and nightmares. We can talk about the relationships between babies and children and parents and sleep. Other things that happen in bed, sex sometimes happens in beds. So we can talk about sex, we can talk about relationships. I then started thinking about what sort of arguments ensue that kind of are around beds. And I was thinking snoring can definitely cause arguments. Also, what about things like pets? Do you have pets on the bed or no? And then of course you've also got your hygiene stuff, so disgusting stuff around bed bugs and the like, right? A whole load of possibilities there. So conversely though, sometimes the problem for me is not that I'm seeing any limits. The problem again is that I have too much freedom. So some of my clients have been open to creating content around a huge array of topics. And I think actually travel clients, this is particularly pertinent for. Most travel clients I've had in the past are cool with creating content around history, culture, language, sport, food, drink, books, movies, TV, music, more and more and more, tons and tons of stuff. And sometimes when I'm doing work for those clients, I find myself flitting from like one topic to another, to another, to another. But I'm not actually getting any concrete ideas down. I think I'm almost distracting myself, right? The range of possibilities cause me to lack focus. And so in that situation, I set my own constraints and I force myself to focus. So like I'll set a timer on my phone for say 15 minutes and just focus on one topic. If I find myself kind of thinking about another topic, I'll jot down a quick note, but I won't allow myself to actually shoot off over here in a completely different direction. I will try and stay focused. And that can be like a useful thing to try. So just to recap this section, constraints do not fuel creativity. They don't. But neither does unlimited freedom. What fuels creativity is striking a balance between freedom and constraint. This is a great quote from Trey Spiegel. He's a mixed media artist. He says, "You have to set up the narrow parameters that you work in, and then within those, give yourself just enough room to be free and play." So I think that's great advice. Okay, so some of this stuff can be solved for with a balanced brief. Some of the stuff you have to solve yourself by altering your mindset or your approach. Cool, let's move on. Point number 2, do you know how to do it? Do you know how to do what you're trying to do? Well, there are a bunch of myths about creativity. Many people believe that ideas just come to you, or that creativity is the ability to conjure ideas out of thin air, and it really is not. That is not what creativity is. What creativity actually is part process and part practice. So I think it's really important to figure out a creative process that works for you and then continually practice and refine it. So I can't tell you what will work for you, but I can share what's working for me right now and my approach. So for me, it's a 3-stage process. I think of it in terms of inspiration, generation, and validation. So when I'm thinking about inspiration, often for inspiration, where I start is those 5 to 10 sites where the company or client want coverage. So I look specifically at those sites or sections of sites, and I look to uncover what is it that journalists are writing about, what topics seem to resonate and be shared a lot. The other thing I do is I also look at competitors. So I don't look at competitor content because I want to rip it off, but I do look at it because I think it can often be directionally interesting and it can open up new topic areas for you that you perhaps hadn't previously considered. The other thing I always look for is data sources. What data sources are publicly available? What isn't? What might I be able to get my hands on? People always ask me about tools at this point, so I will just cover those off kind of quickly. I use BuzzSumo. It's a really great tool for finding the most shared content within a particular topic area, on a particular site or section of a site. It's really, really great. Ahrefs also have a similar tool called Content Explorer, which I know a lot of other people also like. Other things I like to do, I like to search Pinterest, which for inspiration, which might be fun for you, might be something you want to try out. Obviously, Google search is really, really useful. Search Google News, Google image search, that kind of thing too. The other thing I would encourage everybody to have is a swipe file. So I use Pinterest to maintain a swipe file. You don't have to use Pinterest, you can use whatever it is that you want. I kind of like Pinterest because it's visual. And I just put anything and everything in this swipe file. Anything I love, anything I think is interesting. Sometimes I'll add stuff to the swipe file just because I think it's an interesting execution or whatnot. But again, this is really, really useful to refer back to when I am doing creative work. So that was inspiration. The next stage is generation, or making connections, ultimately. So I take all of my inspirational content, all the stuff that I've kind of gathered together that I found which I think is inspiring, and then I start thinking specifically things like, what can I do which will feed into what a journalist is writing about? What could we do around the most resonant topics? Is there something a competitor has done which we could do better or differently? Is there something we could do with a public data source? Is there a way we could get data that isn't readily available right now? Another thing which I quite like to do is bring in broader stuff too. So is there a particular topic which resonates with me, which I could explore within this space? Could be fun. Also, is there something that's been created in a totally unrelated field which I could apply here? Those kind of things. Finally, validation. Validation is pretty simple, right? You're thinking specifically about the ideas, an idea that you've generated. Is this possible? Has this been done before? What's new or different about what you're doing if it has been done before? What evidence do you have that this will resonate? Is this right for the client or company? Is it on brief? That kind of thing. So, the way I've described that process, inspiration, generation, validation, it sounds like a linear process, but actually for me, I don't follow it in a linear fashion necessarily. So sometimes I jump quickly back and forth between inspiration and generation. Sometimes I'll jump from inspiration to generation to validation for a single idea. Other times I'll just look for inspiration and leave generation for another day. Sometimes I'll generate 20 ideas before validating anything. Sometimes the process of generation will push me back and lead me to seek further inspiration. And sometimes when I'm validating one idea, it'll spark a totally new one. And I found that I need to let myself play in each of these spaces in whatever capacity seems to be working for me that day. That for me is kind of the best way of most effective way of following that process. So I let myself jump around however I want, but I still need to be mindful of potential blocks. So common things that can happen: too much inspiration, too much stuff. You get overwhelmed, unfocused, and ultimately blocked. That can be a problem. Generation without inspiration often leads to a block because there's not enough for me to actually make connections with. I haven't got enough inspiration to generate anything. Effectively, what I'm doing then is trying to conjure ideas out of thin air again. Not a good look. Also, another common problem, validation when you're in the wrong mindset can lead to blocks because if you're anything like me, you will reject all of your ideas as being horrible. They're not necessarily horrible. It may just be you're in a bad space, right? So having a process won't actually solve all of your problems, but I do think it helps. And in my experience, following a process yields more reliable results than sitting around trying to conjure ideas out of thin air. So, next point. Do you think you're bad at this? In this industry, we share our most successful content pieces. The trouble is, because we only share our successes, we are inadvertently presenting a skewed version of reality. You only see other people's good ideas. Their bad ideas are invisible. They're invisible partly because they're not shared, but mainly because they don't get coverage. So you're just not aware of other people's failures, right? You're only aware of your own. And I think as a result, I do hear stuff like this a lot. People tell me that when they compare their work to that of others, they feel like they're coming up short. They feel that other people are better at this than they are. And I think it's really important to remember that you are not comparing yourself or your work to reality. You are comparing your whole body of work, all of the successes and all of the failures, to only the most successful work of others. And I kind of just wanted to share with you today, because I too am guilty of this. I share successful content pieces, but those successful content pieces I share are outliers. They perform, they're the ones that performed extraordinarily well, and they probably represent less than 10% of all the work that I've done. So if next time you kind of find yourself comparing yourself to others, maybe, kind of try and check yourself and recognize that you're really not comparing yourself or your work to any kind of reality. I have written more about this on my site. There's a link. Check that out if you're interested. So what happens though when you find yourself in a place like this? You're sitting there, you feel like you're bad at this. What do you do? Well, I think there are a couple of things you can do. One, build yourself up. Remind yourself of successful work that you've done before. We have a tendency as human beings to remember failure and forget success. So remind yourself of your successes. Once you've done that, spend 5 minutes coming up with the worst ideas you possibly can. I recommend this partially because it's fun and it's freeing, and when you feel stuck, it's much, much easier to come up with a whole bunch of really awful ideas than really, really good ones, right? Coming up with good ideas is hard. So it's freeing and it's fun. But also, actually, sometimes you can flip those terrible ideas into something good, which I think is a good reason to play with this kind of stuff. Another thing you might try is doing a creative exercise. Now, I am a massive proponent of creative exercises. These are 3 books that I own and I recommend to everybody. Just a quick point about creative exercises. I feel like perhaps they're misused. I think creative exercises are really, really valuable because they help get you back into flow. That's where they're really, really valuable. I don't think actually necessarily creative exercises are really good for generating ideas. So it's not like you spend 2 minutes doing one of these exercises and suddenly you have 20 good ideas. That's not what they're good for, but they are great at getting you back into flow and being able to see connections and start playing with stuff again. And I think that's where they're really, really powerful. Point number 4, are you constantly being interrupted? Right, interruptions break your flow. When you're interrupted, it takes an average of 23 minutes to get back to the task. So please don't allow yourself to be interrupted, and also don't interrupt yourself, or try not to interrupt yourself. I have definitely been guilty of this. I'll be in the middle of doing something, middle of a task, supposed to be working on something, and suddenly I'll just be like, I'm just going to check my email. Why? No, don't do that. Stick with what you're doing. So close your email, close your social accounts, close Slack or whatever poisonous communication or project management tool you use. Close it. Disable all notifications, put your phone on flight mode. If you work somewhere where you're constantly interrupted, leave that space if you can. I'm not suggesting you quit your job, but go work in a cafe once they're open again, I guess, or a library once they're open again. From home, anywhere where you can kind of limit those interruptions and be in more control. The final thing I want to talk about today is when you're not enjoying what you're doing. Now, this is a really tough one to unpick. Here are some things that I've struggled with, and I'm hoping maybe that you can relate, and there might be some stuff here that's useful for you. So, number 1, are you working in a way that doesn't work for you? Excuse me. First thing I want to talk about is time. Do you know how long it takes you to come up with a set of ideas? You really need to know. If you don't know, you can't schedule your time effectively. So I would strongly suggest you use Toggle or some other time tracking software to track your time over several rounds of ideation. Figure out how long it typically takes you. So over time, I figured out that it takes me around 17 hours for each round of ideation. In 17 hours, I can come up with 4 to 6 workable ideas. Now, sometimes I'm faster than that, sometimes I'm slower. But if I give myself less than 17 hours, I know for sure that my output is not as good. The other thing I've noticed is that when I do the work seems to be really important. So I do my best work between 6 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. So if I'm coming up with a set of ideas, I try to schedule that work over 5 days between 6 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. The next thing I want to talk about is space. So your brain is amazing and it goes on working without you realizing it, which is magical. You might actually have experienced this sort of phenomena. Perhaps you've had an instance where an idea seemingly comes to you out of nowhere, right? You're maybe in the shower, or you're out for a walk, or you're cooking dinner. You weren't trying to come up with an idea, or even consciously thinking about it, but the idea just appeared. Well, I think you can game the system a little bit. When I do creative work like ideation in small bursts over 5 days, I have way more of these instances when ideas just appear. If I concentrate those 17 hours of work over just 2 days, most of the time, none of those ideas just appear. And I suspect it's because I'm not giving myself enough space. So it may not just be that time's important, but space is also important too. So try changing up your routine a little. See if more ideas just appear. The other thing I want to talk about is solo versus team working. So I don't play nicely with others, actually. I'm a really solitary person and I do my best work alone. However, that's not true for everyone. Some people work best in a team, and actually to come up with ideas, they need other people to bounce off. They can't come up with ideas on their own. It just doesn't work for them. And if you try and force them to do so, it feels like punishment to them. Horrendous, right? You don't want to do that. I think it's important to figure out not just when you do your best work, but how. And possibly it's a combination. It'll be a combination for you. So maybe you want to do inspiration on your own, but you want to do generation with others. Or maybe you do inspiration and generation on your own, but you do validation with others. Again, I think it's really important to figure this stuff out so you can schedule your work appropriately. But maybe this isn't the problem at all, right? Is pressure the problem? Coming up with creative ideas in a commercial environment is high pressure. There are deadlines, people are relying on you to deliver. Your job or other people's jobs might actually be on the line, and that is a really heavy load to carry. I'm increasingly of the belief that my best work happens when I'm playing, right? And actually for me, flow is not so much about work feeling like play. Flow only happens for me when I'm able to play. When I'm relaxed and open and curious, but it's very difficult for me to feel relaxed, open or curious when I feel under pressure. Because I frequently find deadlines paralyzing, right? And actually as I approach a deadline, this often happens. I have no ideas, no idea what to do next, and no time to do anything. And it's horrendous. Like my mind gets stuck in this awful loop of there's no time, there's no time, there's no time. I'm not able to think clearly, right? Play is the furthest thing from my mind. And if I remain stuck in that mindset, it's extremely unlikely that I'll come up with anything workable. So I try to flip my mindset. And I think this is the best thing you can do for yourself if you too find yourself stuck like this. There's a couple of things I do. Firstly, sit with the feeling. So somebody told me once that a feeling lasts for a maximum of 1 minute unless you feed it. I have no idea if this is actually true. The only thing I can tell you is that it works for me. And stuff like this, right? This interminable mindset loop of there's no time, there's no time, there's no time. When you're in that space, you are feeding your own anxious feelings. And so they continue to grow and get bigger and bigger. All of that stuff feeds negative feelings. Whereas if you can just take a minute to sit with that negative feeling, awful as it is, don't feed it, just accept it. You may find that it will quickly pass. Other options, write it out. So give yourself 2 minutes to write down all of the things that will happen if you don't deliver those ideas. Now read those things back. If you've gone hard on this exercise and imagined the apocalypse, ask yourself, is that what's really going to happen? Probably not, right? If your list is less than apocalyptic, hopefully it'll give you some perspective. Just a gentle reminder here, we are not working in a life or death environment. It might feel like it sometimes, but we're really not. Final bit of advice, I guess, go outside. Get away from your desk and go outside for 10 minutes. Sometimes I find just getting up and moving is enough to shake off a negative mindset like that. And staying rooted to your desk, like you might feel like you're doing something useful, but you're not. You're not if you're stuck in that mindset. You're much better off taking 10 minutes away, seeing if you can shake it off. Once you've done one or more of those things, whatever works for you, force yourself to play. I often find a completely unrelated creative exercise works better. So don't do a creative exercise directly related to whatever client or company you're trying to ideate for. Just do a completely unrelated exercise. I'm suggesting these books again. Try that. Force yourself to play. I find that spending a few minutes doing something like that often puts me back in flow. Final piece of the puzzle. Are you feeling a more general sense of discontent? Is this work just not satisfying you in the way that you thought it would? If you feel like that, I can definitely relate. What I'd suggest you do actually is consider making some things just for you. It took me a long time to realise that I needed to make things for myself, that having a creative job was not enough. Because whilst client work is often fulfilling, there are frequently compromises that have to be made, and rarely is it the case that I get to make whatever I want. So now I just make stuff for me. This stuff is deliberately not a side hustle. It's stuff that I'm extremely unlikely to be able to monetize effectively, and that's the point. It's an outlet that exists only for me. I'd strongly encourage you to consider whether or not this is something you need to do too. Okay, it's almost time to wrap this thing up. I've gone through an awful lot today. So these are a quick couple of summary slides as a reminder of what we've covered. So next time you're feeling blocked, ask yourself if one or more of these things is the problem. So do you know what to do, right? Is this an external kind of brief type block or an internal mindset block? Generally speaking, I'm 100% confident that constraints don't fuel creativity. Neither does unbounded freedom. We need balance, and you need to strike that balance. Do you know how to do what you're trying to do? Creativity is not the ability to conjure ideas out of thin air. It's process and practice. And if you haven't invested in that process and practice, you will struggle. Invest in that. Do you think you're bad at this? Please remember, you only see other people's good ideas. Other people's bad ideas are invisible, and I promise you, they have just as many bad ideas, in inverted commas, bad ideas, failures, as you do. You're really not alone. If you're constantly interrupted or interrupting yourself, please just stop. Shut down all interruptions. When you're interrupted, it takes you an average of 23 minutes to get back on track. So just close them all down. Focus. And finally, if you're not enjoying what you're doing, think about ways that you might be able to change some stuff up. I am increasingly of the belief that to do good creative work, you need to be in a good place. Final thoughts from me. I'm definitely not at the point where I'm consistently in flow, right? I have days when work feels like play and ideas come easily, but I also have days when creative work feels like pushing water up a hill. Like it's an endless soul-crushing grind. It's hard work. And even though I know what I need to do to get in flow, I can't always get there. I think it's important to note, though, that I suspect something good is happening, right? Even on bad days. Because it's often the case that the following day, when I review what I've done, I can see tons of possibilities. And a good day, where work feels like play and ideas come easily, often follows a bad one. Good luck out there. And I'll happily take some questions. I think we've got about 5 minutes. So yeah, I'll happily take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was awesome. We do have a question that has come through. So back to the brief. If a question gives you a if a client gives you a very open brief, do you go back to them to narrow it down a bit, or are you afraid that by doing so you'll limit your possibilities in future projects?
I think that I would always go back to them, because an open brief is never really open. It's just that they haven't told you what they really want. They know what they want. They've not communicated it. They expect you to know by magic. They're not doing it to be arseholes or anything. That's not what this is about. But they think it's obvious. So they think it's obvious what they want, but it's often not. So I would definitely go back. And even if you can't get them to, so there's definitely stuff that's a struggle, right? Getting a client to tell you what topics they're happy to play in, that kind of thing, is often a struggle. Get the sites from them though. Get those 5 to 10 sites. Telling you, I would love to get coverage on these 5 sites. That's concrete. They already know where they want coverage, and that will give you the steer. I think also the other nice thing about that is if you're starting from those sites, you've got like a compelling reason as to why you've come up with these ideas. But if you think about the way you're structuring a creative deck, it's almost like you said you wanted ideas from the education section of The Guardian. In the past year, the education section of The Guardian has written 50 articles on this topic, and they play on this and this and this. So we're suggesting make that. So it makes the whole thing more coherent, and I think it makes it easier to get ideas signed off, which is another whole talk, right? Get your ideas signed off. Probably shouldn't go into that today, but yeah.
I think that's really good, especially what you're saying about how you bring that back, bring in the brief and how you narrow it down into how you present the ideas back to them. That's a really great tip as well. We do have one more question from Arij. As the client, what's the best way to capturing all internal requirements from different internal teams to help our agency, but doing it in a way without limiting them? So I think it's more coming from the client perspective, what should they be doing to help you?
And I think it's a great question. I mean, I think that don't worry too much about limiting. In some respects, like knowing as a creative, I think that knowing that there's a limit is way more helpful. So for example, let's just take an example. That mattress client, right? They said, we absolutely don't want to do anything about sex. And I was like, oh, come on. Yeah, come on. Like, and they also said there was some other stuff that they were hard nose on around some types of sleep therapies, like ASMR and stuff. And I was like, again, come on, like this is silly of you. But at least if I know that, I'm like, okay, you know what? You've said you don't want to do that. I agree with you. Like, it's a pointless argument for me to have. I can just avoid those topics. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about limiting too much. If there are hard things which are no's, it's better just to know that up front. I think also sometimes it's worth, if you can as an agency, get in front of the people who are most likely to object to your work. So I think sometimes it's a case of asking questions. So like, I think sometimes we ask the wrong questions, like in an agency context. So we'll say things like, who are the stakeholders? You don't need to know the stakeholders. What you need to know is who's going to put the absolute kibosh on your piece? Who's going to stop this from getting published? Like, those are the people that you really need to know and understand their objections. So I think it's kind of, I think maybe getting in front, the ability to get in front of those people early, often really, really useful, really, really useful. I don't know if I've answered that question very well.
I think you have. So true. So I think we're good. We are at time now, so I think if anyone has any questions, Hannah's details are still on the screen. She is a very friendly and helpful person, so she will definitely get back to you. But thank you very much, Hannah. That was awesome. We have a short break now for 20 minutes, and then we'll be back with Mark's presentation. Thanks, everyone.